So let's start with a common myth with adolescence is that it's new, that it's kind of a new thing, that it's kind of burst on the scene in the last couple years. And that's not necessarily true. Adolescence has been around for quite some time. Youth culture, as we know it, is relatively new. Kind of a thing that come to the forefront in the 90s and the early 2000s. So youth culture is relatively new, but adolescence is not a new concept. It's not a new kind of thing, even in terms of how we study academically or how we claim those teenage years or the years right after that. It is not a new term. And so kind of the definition, my working definition of adolescence in kind of two areas that it encompasses, next slide please, is adolescence is both a developmental reality, God's design of who we are and during that phase of adolescence. It's a developmental reality, and it's also a cultural phenomenon. And so that's kind of the environmental aspect. Every one of our adolescent students, every one of our adolescent children, or again, the people we teach or coach or however we interact within our spheres of influence, they're all going to have a developmental reality of the way that God has designed them, the way that God has wired them. But they're also going to have a cultural phenomenon aspect too, that is the environment they grow up in and how that affects them as adolescents. And so that's kind of two parts of adolescence. But if we backtrack again, when I'm saying this is not a new term, adolescence as a term was coined in 1904 by a man named Stanley Hall. And he wrote a book and he well titled it and called it Adolescence. And so it had like a 50-word subtitle under it, but the title of it was Adolescence. And it was the first kind of all-inclusive academic study on the period of adolescence, or the teenage period as we know it in the lives of our students. And let me just go ahead and give you the fair warning. If you've never read this book, has anybody read this book? Good. It is not a positive book. Let's just put it that way. It is not a positive book. Well, I'm just saying in terms of how Stanley Hall relays the information and the studies on the period of adolescence, he does not use positive terms when he's describing what an adolescent teenager's like. And the truth is, I mean, some of us would probably not use the most positive terms sometimes. And so I'm not saying he's completely off base, but let me give you some of the points. And so the first point was he was very negative. And the next point, this is actually how he describes the adolescent period. He describes it as a period of storm and stress, which again probably evokes some memories within all of us, even some of you that have younger adolescents and are already experiencing this. He describes it as a period of storm and stress, a period of just kind of what is going on, what is happening, and just moving in a lot of different directions. And it's interesting, the word he actually uses to describe adolescence is savages. And again, this is not a George Carlin, comedy sketch. This is an academic study that was the most prominent academic study on adolescence until at least 1965. And some more resources come in around that time, but at least for the 50 years after it was wrote, there was not another primary academic study that people studied, that psychologists studied, that sociologists studied when it comes to the period of adolescence. This was the primary source. And he describes basically that adolescents are savages, that they can't reason, they don't know what's going on, and they won't listen to you, and they operate as savages. And so then the last part kind of coming out of that, and because they're savages, they're incapable of reason, of understanding, and that you need to treat them like children. And so the result of that ended up being that if all this is true, if what his study is true, then we must isolate them. We don't need to get them around other adults because they're going to do savage-like things. We need to just put all of the savages in a room and just let them do savage things. And again, it's really funny to think of it in this way, but it's also amazing that this was the leading study that drove the thought process on the adolescent period for well over 50 years. And is still a prominent resource even to this day on the period of adolescence, in the secular world more so. And it's amazing to think that this is how a whole grouping of our population was described and seen as. And that's just amazing to me. And so, but as a Christian leader and as a Christian parent, it evokes this thought in my mind: do we see our teenagers as a problem to be solved, a savage to tame, or a wonder to behold? Which I have to think is what God's perspective is for our teenagers, for our adolescents. I don't think God looks at them and says, if I can just survive that period, if I can just survive the savage that's running around my house, then things are going to be okay. I don't think God looks at our adolescents that way. He looks at them as a wonder to behold, just as he did when he knit them together in the womb. And just as they grew as a child, and just like Christ kind of modeled for us, let the children come to me. I don't think God takes a break and says, okay, savage, run away for a little while and come back as a nice, well-formed adult. And so it bodes the question, especially from Stanley Hall's research, of is that parallel, is that congruent with our God who sees our students as a wonder to behold? And so we begin out of that statement looking, and I want to give you a quick, just as we're talking about adolescence, and so the way that I've heard it defined is provisional adulthood, becoming a provisional adult. And so if we're thinking of that in analogy, it's almost like when you're a child that it's a highway. And so we just see your basic highway. That's a really nice highway. It's obviously not from Alabama, but I was just thinking of my childhood there, zipping down these highways that they weren't that nice. There's a lot of potholes, but childhood is this 2-lane highway that our children are going down. It's kind of under control. Theoretically, the speed limit's 45, and it's kind of tame. And then we have, when you transfer to adulthood, you have an interstate. And you have madness, and I don't know where that is, maybe somewhere with water. But you have this adulthood where we're full speed ahead. We're full speed ahead. We got a lot of things going on. We're balancing a lot of things. And so in the mindset of provisional adulthood, the adolescent period is that on-ramp between the two of them. And we go to Sketchville to the on-ramp here. But if you've ever wondered, if you Google on-ramps, there's not a lot of pictures to choose from. And so interstates and highways, they're galore. There's pages and pages of them, but on-ramp, not as much. So I'm sorry about Area 51 where I had to get this on-ramp picture. But if that's how we're looking at the adolescent period, it is that on-ramp from childhood to adulthood. Adolescence is that period, and we're going to look at, but I want to go ahead and say, there's things that each adolescent needs to accomplish to be able to get onto that on-ramp and to be able to trek towards adulthood. Because I've seen a lot of families, and we're seeing, and I'll show you some research that kind of backs it up, that a lot of families aren't allowing their adolescents to even get to the point of being a true adolescence in the sense of being on the on-ramp to adulthood. They try to play it safe and keep them on the highway, that is childhood, and they're never allowing them a chance to even start the trek to adulthood. And we're going to talk about some of that coming out of the research. And so let's talk about the length of adolescence. So when Stanley Hall wrote the book in 1904, let me give you the key real quick. So when you're looking at this, it's really hard to do a chart in Planning Center. So first number will be the year. Next two numbers will be the starting age of adolescence, which is the onset of puberty, and then the end age, which is when they have become an adult, and then the duration. So in 1904, when Stanley Hall wrote his book, this was, on average, the onset of adolescence was 14 and a half, and the ending of adolescence was 16 years old. And so we've got a period of 18 months, a year and a half. That was your adolescence period. It was a very short period. It was a very short period of savagery in Stanley Hall's mind, and then they were expected to become adults because, let's face it, the graduation rates at that time, from most studies I've seen, were around 13% at the most, like going all the way through a 12th grade, finishing school before you started working. And so now let's look to 1970. Adolescent now, the onset is now 13 years old. The end period is 18 for a period of about 5 years. And there's a couple of things to note there, that primarily after World War II, it was instilled that it was an expectation, and even backed by law to a certain extent, that you were expected to go to school through 12th grade. We went from 13% going through 12th grade in 1904 to about probably, I would say 93% going through 12th grade in 1970. And so what happened in that period, why adolescence was extended, was because you had the first inkling of youth culture. All these students now being in the same high school, spending time, we'll say 40 hours a week together in a school, a youth culture developed, and it was now a different understanding of when you were expected to begin being an adult. Some had the option to go to college, some had the option to start work, but on average, around 18, you became an adult, which means you might have been self-sufficient in college and been an adult studying and kind of working towards your education, or you may have worked. And so here's the scary part. So 2019, current state of adolescence. So, and again, please know, there's a bell curve to each of these. 80% is going to fall in that range. You may have 20% that start the onset earlier. You may have 20% that start the onset later, and on both ends. And so there's a bell curve that we're playing here. But this is the 80% number. So now, on average, the onset of adolescence is 10, and the end point is 30. So here's the thing, and here's what we're going to learn from the next part, is basically there's 3 tasks that an adolescent needs to accomplish. There's 3 tasks that every adolescent, and this is where we're kind of getting into the meat potatoes. There's 3 tasks that every adolescent is looking to accomplish, to figure out about themselves. And this is how we get those numbers, and we're going to talk about more specifically why that last number is what it is. But there's 3 different things that every adolescent are looking to do. The first thing they're looking to do is figure out their identity. They're wanting to answer the question, who am I? Not who does everybody say that I am. They're trying to answer the question, who am I? Not who do my parents say I am, not who do the teacher says I am, who am I? And that's one of the first tasks that they're trying to accomplish as an adolescent. The second question is a question of autonomy. Why am I here? Why do my choices matter? Why am I on this earth? Why am I in this position that I am? Why does the choices that I make every day matter? That's the second task that every adolescent is trying to accomplish. And then the third task is the belonging question or affinity. Where and to whom do I belong? That's the third thing that every adolescent is trying to accomplish. And so I'll touch on it real quick. There's a reason that last period of adolescence is so much longer and why we're trending in such a direction, because you do not exit the adolescent stage until you at least get some answers to these questions. I'm not saying you have to figure them out completely, but your exiting the adolescent stage is based on you being able to have an answer for these questions. Whether it's a conscious, I wrote this down answer in my journal and I know, or it's a subconscious answer because others have affirmed into you who they see you are and you figured out who you are, why you're here, where do you belong. And so that's why we're seeing this trajectory now is a lot of students aren't getting to answer some of these questions. Maybe they're being answered for them. Maybe they're not being able to have the chance to work through the task of adolescence. And so if we're thinking about these different kind of areas, there's always, at every point in history so far, there's been a primary focus point out of these 3. So let's think of it in the form of a 3-legged stool. There's 3 different legs, but they're all important to the integrity of the stool itself. And so the first focal point in history was identity. And that was kind of that post-World War II period through 1970. And so if we're thinking in the church model, basically in those years in church history, church didn't really do anything for students at that point. They would say, hey, go to the adult class, go to the Sunday school class, just you sit in worship. You're not a child anymore in children's church, so you're with the adults now. But people like Campus Crusade or people, Christ in Action or FCA or Young Life would go do presentations at the schools, and the main thing they would do is they would tell the students what their identity was as followers of Christ. As a Christian, this is who you are. And that was really effective because the primary focal point, because youth culture had just developed. You saw in 1970 how adolescence had just become a 5-year process. And really in those 50s and 60s, high schools had developed, so you got these students together, and they were asking, hey, who are we? What's this culture that we're developing? Like, what decisions should we make? And they begin thinking, because no longer did they see themselves as child to adult, they knew there was this buffer zone, and they began to ask the question, who am I? And so that was the primary focal point up until 1970. And so then 1970, there was a shift to the autonomy question, and you can think of just the movements of the 70s and the late 60s. Why do my choices matter? Why am I here? And I was even on the back end of this as a student in the 90s. I went to church for the first times because I wanted to know what was my purpose, why am I here? I can remember that in 7th grade, that was why I went to church, was not really to answer my identity question. I wanted to know why I was here and what I could do to help aid God's mission in the world. And so churches made a shift because they had seen the success of the Young Lives and the FCAs and the things that would go to the students. Churches made a shift to say, hey, those programs are working really well. We should hire one of the people like those Young Life directors or like those FCA directors. We should hire one of those to come do this at our church, do those programs at our church. So churches began hiring youth pastors, essentially, or student ministers or directors of student ministry, whatever you want to look at it. And they would come and they would help students through events and programs find out not only who they are, but why their choices matter and why they're here. And so that was a long period from 1970 to 2000. And so here's what happened. So heading into now, 2000 to present, the main focal point of every adolescent is the belonging aspect. Where do I belong? And let me tell you why. Because around the year 2000 and in the 1990s, youth culture became the prominent culture. It became the prominent culture in society. And you can look at kind of the switchover that happened at that point to where parents started listening to the music that was popular with the students. I can think of that. I was right on the back end of that because my dad and my mom never wanted to listen to music that was popular to me and to my age group. But as I become really 8th, 9th, 10th grade, my parents started tuning into the music I was listening to. And there was this process of youth culture becoming the predominant culture really in America. And it was the focal point culture. But here's the downside of that. Students never wanted that to be the case. Adolescents never wanted their culture to be the most prominent culture. So what happened, youth culture as we know it just splintered into hundreds and thousands of subcultures. No longer the hierarchy of even when I was in school where you may have had, the athletes or the jocks as we would call them, the academics as I call them because I'm not mean and I don't call them nerds. And then you had a couple of other significant subgroups, and you pretty much instantly, when you went into school, knew where you fit within that hierarchy. There wasn't much room to debate. And yeah, there was some room to go up or down or to elevate or go to here, there, but it didn't change that much from the time you walked into school until you graduated school. But when youth culture splintered, there is now hundreds and thousands of possible subcultures that our adolescents can fit into. And so with that splintering and with that shift is where belonging took over, because now no longer students can walk into a school and quickly learn, or even walk into a church youth group or walk into any situation and quickly learn, oh, that's where I belong. I play a lot of sports, so I belong to those people. I love to read and study, so I belong with these people. I'm not like either of those two groups, so I must belong with this group. No longer is it cut and dry anymore. Now our students are bombarded with so many options, consciously or subconsciously, to what grouping they may fall with another, that now belonging is the key lens that our adolescents are looking through. And I see it all the time with student ministry. If we don't greet students well when they come in the door, they may never come back, because instantly they may feel like they don't belong, and they may immediately not be able to ever shake that feeling. The next week when a parent says, hey, do you want to go back? That feeling's going to come to their mind, and that is the primary lens that they're looking through. Again, on a three-legged stool, all legs are important. They're still trying to answer those two questions of who am I, but those two questions are being formulated through the third question, through the main lens, through the belonging question. And so it's very important to understand that no longer can we not take serious, and I'm looking at myself more and how we structure our environments, kind of the lacking of, oh, I don't feel like I belong here. That kind of statement from our students has high level of significance to their adolescent developments because that's the primary lens that they are looking through. And so kind of here we are. We've kind of talked through some of the statistics. We've looked at some different stuff. And now I want to do some short application just through kind of questions I have when I look at that research and questions I've been thinking on. And I want to do a couple of quick things just out of that information. And so the first thing comes from the mindset of belonging being the primary focus point. And so here's a myth that I often fall under as well. Time spent together will lead to belonging. I think a lot of us would just assume that if I spend time with my adolescent, if I spend time with other adolescents I'm working with, that will lead to belonging. But that is not the case. The truth is, connecting with people is the key to belonging. No longer just being in the same environment it has the opportunity to lead to belonging. But it's truly connecting and investing in people is what leads us and is the key to belonging. And so that's a myth that I see a lot, that, hey, if we're just at the table or if we just make the effort to go to this place together, belonging will be felt by my adolescent. But that's not entirely true. It's connecting, it's investing will lead and is the key to belonging. And again, I have to tell myself this. Just because I'm in the same room as 50 kids for Sunday school doesn't mean that they feel a sense of belonging within our program. I have to connect with students. Our life group leaders have to connect with students. Crowd control's not the MO anymore. Just because we put on a cool program doesn't mean that belonging is going to be felt within our students. It's connecting with them. It's finding a way, and that goes with any of us that works with adolescents or has adolescents in our homes. And so another big thing, and this is kind of the question, obviously you as parents, you're going to try to teach your adolescents a lot, as you should. They're provisional adults, they're not adults. You know things that they need to know, but it's important to understand how, in a postmodern world, that these adolescents are learning things. And so all of us, really anybody 30 plus in the modern world, this is how we processed information. So facts, we were taught that facts drove the train, faith supported the facts, and our feelings, I've always learned just that they were pretty much evil sometimes, and that you couldn't trust them. That's what I learned, and that's how my parents kind of taught me, and kind of the very conservative area I grew up in. And so this is how we understand what is true. Really anybody, again, 30 plus kind of that grew up in a modern world, we understand this is true based on you teach me a fact, I have faith in that fact, and then my feelings is kind of in the caboose somewhere. It may support the fact, it may encourage the fact, but if it goes against the fact, then it's kind of a dumb feeling and it's just got to go. It's got to fall off the back of the train. See you later. And so this is kind of how we understand what is true, but anybody predominantly under the age of 30 in a postmodern world, which is what we're in, this is how they experience things. Experience, not feelings. It's not a role reversal. It's not feelings now drives the train, because our feelings are sometimes corrupt and worldly and can't be trusted sometimes. But it's experience drives the train now. And the best example I can use, I don't have children again, but as a youth pastor, it's giving students opportunities to experience the presence of God. Not just me tell them that God loves them and tell them that God's presence is in them. It's to have the opportunity to allow them to experience the love of God. And it's funny because I used to go to church conferences and things, and you could tell who the Christian kids were. Maybe in worship, they would have their hands up and they're worshiping and they're excited and it's, go Jesus, and you're like, oh look, there's the Christian kids. And some of the ones that, I'm not saying we're unchristian, but maybe we're still searching, are not followers of Christ, would kind of be more in the back, and they're just like, I don't know what's going on. This is scary. And you could kind of tell the divide. But now I've noticed a lot of students who again, this is not a judgmental fact, it's the reality of the situation, is a lot of students that I would not know of as a follower of Christ through conversations I've had with them. I watch them worshiping, and I have to catch myself a lot of times saying, how does that work? But it's because of this truth that all teenagers, all adolescents, they learn through experience now. It's almost like the trying on process of clothes. They learn through experience something. That's what drives their learning process. And then faith backs that up, and then facts supports the whole thing. And so I just want you to know that as you may teach your children, your adolescents, something coming out of this, whether it be about anything we've learned here, just about anything in life in general, I would love for you just to know information that was really helpful to me. This is how students learn now. It's through experience. It's not as much through, I'm going to sit you down, I'm going to tell you the information you need to know, you're going to learn it then, you're going to believe in it then, and if you have any feelings that feel differently about it, put them in the back of the train. There's a whole different process that students learn through, and it's this process of helping your student experience the lesson, faith back it up, and then facts back it up at the end, being a supporting system to give them the facts maybe after the experience, or maybe they come to you saying, hey, I experienced this in this situation, I would love to know more, and maybe that's when facts and faith come in and support the whole process. And so that's another kind of just a tidbit out of what we're learning. And so in this last part, I want to answer the question, why is the adolescent period so long now? And so we're going to talk about some things that have been trending in society. And so some of the reasons that we are at a current period of adolescence being so long, one of the first reasons is the removal of negative consequences. And this is always out of the goal, I want my adolescent to be happy. And again, you have a parenting instinct that I don't have, but I can still see these trends happening quite a bit, that we are very quick to remove the negative consequences and to do whatever it takes so that our adolescent won't have to feel that consequence. And it may make Mama Bear or Papa Bear happy, but it doesn't help in the process of that adolescent escaping the adolescence process and kind of rendering in the process of being a provisional adult. Because we know when they're adults, they're going to have to deal with their situations and deal with the negative consequences. And so helping our adolescents feel those consequences, handle those consequences, is very important to theoretically cutting down that gap that we see now of 10 to 30 as adolescents. Next thing, not allowing for ownership of decisions. And this kind of go right hand, left hand, A and B with the one in front of it. But a lot of people who are responsible for adolescence now are very quick to make the decision for their adolescent and to not give their adolescent the opportunity to make decisions. And these can be very simple decisions, or these can be very difficult decisions. They can be decisions of where do you want to go eat tonight, or they can be much, much higher level than that. But we are so quick to impart what we think adolescents are supposed to do that, again, we're hurting their growth possibilities because we're not allowing them to make decisions. And we're not allowing them to own those decisions and to see the results of those decisions and to say, hey, my decision worked out. Or back to part A, my decision didn't work out, and now I have to figure out how to deal with it. The third thing is the removal from adult influences. And so this is not as harsh as it may sound. I don't think any parents is like, you know what, I'm not letting other adults influence you. That's corrupt. I want to teach you what you need to know. No, I'm coming more from Stanley Hall's definition of adolescence, to where if they're incapable and if they're just savages of nature, why do I want to burden other adults with this savage being around them? It's coming from that definition. It's coming from that thought process. And the perception on our part coming out of that is the perceived longing that we think for our students is, this is what I want. I don't want to be around other adults. I want to be around my classmates and my friends, I don't want to spend time with adults. But the actual longing within them is that they do want to be around other adults because they want to see what their lives looks like. In their state of provisional adulthood, they want to know, hey, what is that job like? What is that person's day-to-day life like? And those are things that they never get to understand, they never get to learn on if they're not around adult influences. And even that, within a faith context, the most recent study says that every student should have 5 influential adults in them to be able to keep their faith going past high school. We all see the statistics. We see 70% of students that used to be churchgoers no longer go to church when they get to college. And the study that's combating that is saying that it's from a lack of adult influences and investment within them, whereas we used to look like, oh, well, they have a youth group leader who's great, or they have a small group leader who's great. But the most recent study shows for success and for faith to flourish going forward in college, every adolescent, every student needs 5 adults. And that can be, hey, here's a prayer partner, here's a friend in faith or confirmation, here's a small group leader, here's his baseball coach from the 9th grade. It doesn't have to be an ongoing day in and day out role for all 5 of those adults, but they need 5 significant adults that have spoken in their life, invested in them, and are supporting them in their faith journey. And it's the same way in adolescent development. There needs to be numerous adults supporting our adolescents, walking with them, supporting them as well. And due to us saying, hey, well, my kid's kind of crazy and he just wants to kind of play video games all day and he just wants to hang out. That may be the perceived longing, but the subconscious longing for every adolescent is I want to be around adults. I want to learn what adulthood's like. Just like in 1904 when that period was short and they would go apprentice with someone, probably starting 14 or 15, and they would learn the trade and they would learn and somebody would teach them this is what life is like. That's why, and that's part of the reason, other than many other societal and cultural environments, but that's part of the reason that adolescents escaped the adolescent period so far, is because they had adult influences investing in them and helping them see what their future would be like. Help them see what, when they dropped the provisional from adulthood and from their period, what it was going to be like for them. And so then the last part does deal with that incapable mindset. Here's the thing. Our adolescents, they have an ability to take risk and to have passion that we lose when we get older. Again, this is not a period to just pacify and say, all right, let's survive this thing. Let's get through this thing. Let's get through the savagery. Let's get through the wildness. Let's get through the storm and the stress. But the truth is that if we help walk with them in these tasks of adolescence, and if we help in this process to surround them with adults that affirm them and support them, not tell them what to do only, but to affirm them and support them and let them see what their lives looks like, then we can release the adolescent's ability to influence the world, the adolescent's ability to risk and to have passion about things. Because we've stopped looking at them as being incapable and started looking at them as a wonder to behold. For you, so a couple of questions for reflection. One, how can my adolescent belong? How can I help my adolescent belong? Most important question you can ask yourself on a daily basis. Maybe if you think, my driving them for education success, and if you look and have an awareness that, hey, it's kind of overbearing, you may think it is setting them up. And don't get me wrong, helping them get to a great institution, have a great education is amazing for your student and only helps them in the long run. But if you're hurting their feeling of belonging within your home, then it's hurting their adolescent development. And so that may be a question that you need to ponder. How can I help? Maybe you're already doing a great job at it, but now that you know that that is the primary lens of how they look through every situation every day, whether it's school or church or sports teams or whatever, maybe you can ask, how can I do that even better? How can I have their need for belonging at the forefront of my mind each and every day? Another question we can ask ourselves is, how can I partner with my student or adolescent in accomplishing the task of adolescence? And so I will say most research shows that adolescents, kind of that 10, 11, 12 to 14, they have the mental capability to start formulating thoughts on these questions, but they're not a driving thought in their head like it will be when they become 15, 16, 17. They have the thoughts kind of ringing in their head, but they're not looking for the answer as strongly as they may in the later parts of their teen years. And so if you have students that are younger, you can start thinking this and processing their decisions and maybe start introducing this terminology to them. But please understand that it may not catch hold or answers may not fully formulate until they're a little bit older. But this is still, now that you know, these are the three things that every adolescent, it's within God's design for them, is trying to accomplish. You can just have it on your mindset from now forward. How do I help my adolescent? How do I partner with them to answer, to work through those three tasks? And then the last thing, what adult influences can speak into my adolescent's life? And I know lives are busy, and I'm not asking anybody to start pestering other adults. Will you please hang out with my kid? Will you please let them shadow you at work? I don't know if they want to be a doctor, but you're a doctor, and just, I know it's surgery and it's heart surgery, that's fine. They can stand in the corner, please. I would hope you would be a little more strategic than that. But I will ask that you have it on your mind, how can I continue to seek and to find adult influences to affirm and to speak into my adolescent's life? I don't know what that looks like for you, but to have that question on your forefront as you meet a coach who just really seems to gel with your adolescent, or as you meet a teacher, how can you approach that teacher and, again, not weird them out and say, hey, I really need you to show extra effort in my student, because that's what every teacher wants to hear with their other 30 students. But just keep that in mind and maybe even pray for those influences to develop, because we know our adolescents need that. They need that. They're longing for that subconsciously. They'll probably never admit it on the outside, and our perception is not that, but they're longing for it in their development and in their subconscious. And so those are some questions for reflection.